Hello everyone. I hope you're settling in comfortably because today, we're going to wander through the quiet yet fascinating corridors of history, exploring a life most of us can barely imagine. Imagine, if you will, the vast palaces of medieval China, the intricate gardens, the golden halls where dragons and phoenixes are embroidered into silk tapestries, and the emperor, the man who holds the fate of millions in his hands, walking slowly along jade-studded corridors, pondering matters that could change the course of history. It is a life of power, yes, but also a life of isolation, responsibility, and rituals that begin before the first hint of dawn and continue until the moon hangs high over the forbidden city. Before we dive too deep into the quiet hum of this world, I wonder, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are right now? It's always intriguing to know the corners of the world from which these stories travel. Being an emperor in medieval China was not simply a matter of wearing ornate robes and sitting on a dragon throne. It was an existence governed by ceremony, strategy, and a relentless flow of decisions that could tip the balance of peace or invite chaos. Each morning began in a silence that was both sacred and tense, with attendants tiptoeing around courtyards as the emperor prepared for the day. Breakfast was not a casual affair. Dishes were carefully chosen by ministers who understood which foods would fortify his body and mind for the tasks ahead. There would be steamed buns filled with delicate meats or pastes, tiny bowls of rice congee flavored with ginger or preserved vegetables, and the occasional fruit so rare that it had to be delivered from distant provinces by specially commissioned couriers. Each bite was savored not only for nourishment but as a reminder of the empire's reach and the intricate logistics that kept the capital supplied with its luxuries. After breakfast, the emperor would convene with his council, a group of men and sometimes women of extraordinary education and shrewd insight. Here, laws were debated, taxes were discussed, and the empire's borders were monitored through messengers who carried reports of distant towns, rebellious provinces, or strange occurrences along the Silk Road. Sometimes these meetings would stretch for hours, the emperor listening, asking pointed questions, sometimes sharing stories from his own life to illustrate a point. Rumors suggest that some emperors would even test their ministers with riddles or hypothetical crises to gauge their wisdom and loyalty. For in this life, trust was a commodity as precious as gold. Yet life was not all solemnity. The emperor, despite his power, was human and craved entertainment, companionship, and fleeting moments of levity. In the late morning, he might walk through the palace gardens where lotus flowers floated gently on serene ponds and peacocks strutted proudly, their feathers catching the sunlight. Here, he could meet with favored poets, musicians, or calligraphers who performed privately, entertaining him with melodies played on gushings, or sharing verses that praised the empire while subtly weaving in truths about the people's hardships. Tea ceremonies were common, a slow, meticulous practice where each sip, each inhale of aroma, was a meditation, a connection to the traditions that had defined the dynasty for generations. Lunch often mirrored breakfast in its precision, yet with an added layer of ritual. Foods were presented in sequences meant to symbolize prosperity, longevity, or wisdom. Fish was often served whole to signify abundance, while noodles were long and unbroken, a subtle wish for a long life. Attendants would note every preference, every subtle shift in expression, as a simple sigh could indicate disapproval or unease. Stories passed down suggest that emperors sometimes found unexpected joy in tasting foods that were unusual or spicy, a small rebellion against the rigid structure of court life, though these indulgences were often shared quietly, away from prying eyes. Afternoons could be spent reviewing art collections, inspecting newly crafted silk robes, or overseeing the construction of palaces, canals, or bridges, where each stone placed carried weight beyond its physical form. The emperor's presence was symbolic, a reminder that even as he walked through these projects, the empire moved forward under his gaze. And yet, life was also punctuated by intrigue. Courtiers whispered in corners, and the emperor, with a mix of amusement and caution, had to discern friend from foe. Stories suggest that some emperors had spies within their own households, even among their closest attendants, to ensure that plots were discovered before they could flourish. Evenings brought another form of ritual: elaborate dinners, often accompanied by performances of acrobatics, shadow puppetry, or dramatic reenactments of legendary battles. The emperor would recline on cushions, observing, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply letting his mind wander across the tapestry of his day. Rarely, he might slip away to a secluded pavilion with a trusted companion or a scholar to discuss philosophy, astronomy, or the strange, distant lands that lay beyond the empire's reach. In these moments, the emperor was both ruler and man, burdened by power yet seeking, in quiet ways, the same pleasures and curiosities as anyone else. Sleep came late and was regulated by rituals, often with incense burned to purify the air, guards posted discreetly, and servants ensuring the emperor's chambers were prepared exactly as required. Dreams, they say, were interpreted by trusted advisors, each vision dissected for omens or warnings. A restless night could weigh heavily the next day, influencing decisions that touched millions. And yet, amid all this structure, there was beauty, subtle humor, fleeting companionship, and a sense of purpose that few could truly grasp, a life both extraordinary and lonely in equal measure. As the emperor's evening rituals drew to a close, the palace did not fall silent, though the world outside the walls may have already begun to drift into slumber. Lanterns flickered along the courtyards, their warm glow casting elongated shadows that danced upon the carved stones, giving life to the very walls themselves. Within the inner chambers, musicians practiced quietly, their notes lingering like soft whispers, while scribes, seated cross-legged, recorded the day's events in meticulous calligraphy, documenting the movements of the empire as if each stroke of ink could somehow capture its soul. It is said that even the rustle of a silk robe or the careful placement of a teacup could become a matter of significance, observed by ministers who had learned to read subtle gestures and half-hidden expressions, decoding intentions hidden beneath layers of etiquette and ritual. The emperor himself, despite the weight of responsibility pressing upon him like the golden dragon throne, sometimes found himself wandering through the gardens at night, under the silver gaze of the moon. These were moments of rare solitude, when the air was scented with jasmine and the faint sound of water trickling from carved stone fountains filled the silence. Here, he might consider the events of the day, the whispers of rebellion or the subtle discontent of distant provinces, and the weight of these thoughts could press heavily upon even the strongest mind. Yet there was also serenity in these moments, a reminder that even the ruler of an empire of millions was still connected to the natural world, the same wind brushing his face that touched farmers and merchants far beyond the palace gates. Entertainment, though often formal, sometimes took on unexpected forms, especially when visiting dignitaries or emissaries arrived from distant lands. These guests, representing kingdoms as varied as the deserts of Central Asia or the islands to the south, brought with them new stories, exotic foods, and curious objects that captivated the emperor's imagination. Golden trinkets, spices that perfumed the air with unfamiliar scents, and tales of strange customs were carefully examined, not merely for amusement but as lessons in diplomacy and the ways of the wider world. Even a seemingly trivial gift, a silk scarf patterned with unfamiliar symbols, or a small mechanical toy, could carry profound political meaning, and the emperor learned early that the world beyond his walls was as intricate as the calligraphy that adorned his scrolls. Meals continued to mark the rhythm of life in subtle ways, and mid-evening suppers, though lighter than breakfast or lunch, remained deliberate in their selection. Dishes were chosen not only for taste but for symbolism: sweet dates representing harmony, bamboo shoots for resilience, and tea steeped with chrysanthemum petals for clarity of mind. It is said that some emperors developed a near-obsessive attention to these details, as if the combination of flavors, textures, and colors could somehow influence the fate of the empire itself. Chefs were revered, their skills honed over decades, with some recipes passed down through generations, known only to a handful of trusted hands, guarded as jealously as the empire's treasures. But not all moments were dictated by food or ceremony. In certain quiet hours, the emperor might convene private councils with favored generals or trusted ministers to discuss matters of strategy, border security, or intelligence reports from far-flung provinces. These sessions were intense, filled with maps, miniature models, and coded messages, each detail scrutinized carefully, for a single misstep could result in rebellion or loss of life. Historical accounts suggest that some emperors enjoyed the challenge of these discussions, testing their ministers' ability to think creatively, to anticipate the movements of rivals, or to propose solutions that balance strength with diplomacy. In these moments, the palace became a chessboard, each person a piece, each decision capable of altering the game in unforeseen ways. Amidst the weight of governance, there were also more personal pursuits, though often hidden from the public eye. Poetry, painting, and calligraphy offered a quiet solace, an escape into worlds shaped entirely by imagination and expression. The emperor might linger over a brushstroke, correcting a curve, adding subtle shading, or reading aloud a line of verse, savoring the sound of language as much as the meaning. In these moments, the isolation that came with absolute power softened, revealing a man capable of reflection, emotion, and a desire to leave something lasting beyond decrees and battles. It is fascinating to consider how these quiet pursuits, often dismissed as mere hobbies, were, in reality, crucial to the mental balance of someone entrusted with an empire. Evenings occasionally hosted performances that were theatrical in both scale and subtlety. Acrobats leapt from ropes and scaffolds, illustrating tales of heroism and loyalty. Dancers, moving with the fluidity of water, enacted legends of gods and mortals. Shadow puppets told stories of past dynasties, victories, and follies. The emperor observed, sometimes silently, sometimes prompting questions, seeking to uncover lessons hidden within the art. Stories that could inform governance, reveal human nature, or serve as subtle warnings. The interplay between spectacle and instruction became a delicate balance, one that kept the court entertained while reminding all present of the weight and purpose of imperial life. Finally, as the night deepened and the world outside the palace walls slumbered under the watchful moon, the emperor retired. Even in sleep, rituals persisted. The careful placement of bedding, the lighting of incense for a peaceful night, guards stationed to observe any unusual movement, and attendants ready to respond should the slightest disturbance occur. Dreams, historically, were never taken lightly. Prophets and scholars interpreted visions, patterns, and symbols, providing counsel that might influence decisions the following day. And so, even in repose, the emperor's life remained entwined with the empire's pulse, a rhythm that never truly ceased, a current that flowed inexorably from dawn to dusk and back again, weaving together power, ritual, and the quiet humanity that defined one of the most fascinating lives imaginable. Morning in the imperial palace arrived slowly, with the soft light filtering through ornate screens, gilded and carved with dragons, phoenixes, and twisting clouds. The emperor's waking was a ceremony in itself, performed with precision and observation, for even the slightest deviation from routine could ripple through the court with unforeseen consequences. Attendants approached silently, carrying trays with warm water infused with delicate herbs, a subtle fragrance that promised clarity of mind for the challenges to come. As the emperor rose, robes of silk, patterned with celestial motifs, were carefully arranged by attendants who understood the exact folds and placements, a choreography that was as much art as duty. Even the choice of slippers and the direction he faced while stepping into the morning sunlight held meaning, symbols rooted in centuries of tradition that guided not only his health but his fortune for the day. Breakfast, while familiar in its array of steamed buns, congee, and rare fruits, offered subtle variations depending on the season and even the emperor's personal inclinations that morning. One can imagine the emperor savoring the first bite of a sweetened rice cake, noting the texture, the subtle fragrance, and the harmony of flavors, perhaps making a mental note to have the chefs experiment further with delicate spices or unusual combinations. But even these small indulgences were not free from the weight of symbolism. Each dish was a message, an expression of abundance, of balance, and of careful attention to the empire's well-being. Courtiers watching silently understood that even the simplest act, such as taking an extra sip of tea, might hint at approval or dissatisfaction with a recent decree or performance, making every gesture a subtle form of communication. Once breakfast concluded, the emperor often ventured into the administrative chambers, where mountains of reports awaited his scrutiny. Letters from governors, merchants, military commanders, and scholars arrived daily, detailing everything from market fluctuations in distant provinces to tensions along the northern borders. Maps were unfurled on carved tables, miniature soldiers and markers positioned carefully to visualize strategies and troop movements. The emperor's mind worked not in isolation but as part of a delicate ecosystem of advisors, secretaries, and ministers, each offering insights, projections, or counsel. Some advisors were feared for their candor, others cherished for their diplomacy, yet all understood that their words carried weight capable of shaping the empire's fate. And among these reports, even trivial matters, an unusual harvest, the sudden death of a local magistrate, or the appearance of a rare comet, were examined with intensity, for in the medieval Chinese worldview, such occurrences could be interpreted as omens, hints from heaven about the empire's path. Despite the weight of administration, the emperor also sought engagement with the people's culture, even if only through mediated experiences. Artists and craftsmen were invited to display their creations, ranging from intricate jade carvings to embroidered silks that depicted mythical creatures with startling realism. Occasionally, scholars brought philosophical debates to the emperor, exploring questions of ethics, governance, and human nature. Some discussions lingered on the morality of wealth and power, while others dissected the ethics of punishment, military action, or alliances with distant kingdoms. It is said that the emperor, though steeped in ritual and ceremony, valued intellectual challenge deeply, testing not only the logic of his advisors, but their creativity and courage in presenting unconventional solutions. Afternoons often included physical engagement, though not in the sense of battle. Archery, horseback riding, and even martial practice were carefully monitored, blending skill, discipline, and ritual. Courtyards were alive with the sound of hooves striking stone, the whisper of silk sleeves in motion, and the distant clatter of arrows striking targets. Yet, even in these exercises, subtle messages were embedded. A misstep by a general in the emperor's presence could hint at inattention, while flawless execution could earn praise or advancement. Observers understood that every movement, every posture, even every breath, was weighed against centuries of precedent, the expectations of ancestors, and the subtle politics of the court. Entertainment, however, remained a vital counterbalance to the relentless rhythm of duty. Storytellers, poets, and musicians performed in private chambers, their work not merely for amusement, but as a lens through which the emperor might glimpse the heart of the people or the lessons of history. Shadow plays depicted legendary battles with astonishing detail, sometimes offering cautionary tales, sometimes celebrating heroism. Musicians experimented with scales and instruments, seeking harmony and resonance, and poets wove verses that praised the empire while subtly hinting at the complexities of human desire, ambition, and folly. In these moments, the emperor engaged not as a ruler but as a participant in a dialogue across time, tradition, and imagination, finding joy, insight, and perhaps even solace in art that mirrored the empire itself. Grand, intricate, and endlessly complex. Evening descended slowly, marked by the gradual lighting of lanterns and the soft murmur of the palace as servants, guards, and entertainers prepared for night rituals. The emperor often walked through gardens, tracing paths lined with flowering trees, whispering brooks, and statues depicting immortal beings. Each step was deliberate, a meditation, a connection to a world beyond politics and power. Conversations with confidants during these walks ranged from philosophical musings to personal reflections, providing glimpses of humanity beneath the golden robes and dragon-emblazoned robes. And as night deepened, the emperor returned to private chambers where rituals of rest, contemplation, and sometimes divination unfolded. Incense burned, cushions were adjusted, and dreams, interpreted by trusted advisors, were recorded as guides for action, for omens, or for understanding the invisible currents shaping the empire. In this blend of power, ceremony, solitude, and curiosity, the life of an emperor in medieval China revealed itself not as a static throne-bound existence, but as a continuous flow of duty, reflection, and the subtle pursuit of understanding both the world and oneself. The following days in the imperial palace unfolded with a rhythm that combined routine, spectacle, and the quiet tension of unspoken expectations. The emperor awoke to the faint sound of morning bells resonating through the corridors, a signal that the world outside, already bustling with merchants, farmers, and officials, awaited his attention. Breakfast, ever a ceremony of taste, symbolism, and careful observation, introduced subtle variations, sometimes inspired by distant provinces or by rare ingredients sent as tribute. Dishes might include glistening slices of pear steeped in fragrant syrup, tender dumplings stuffed with fragrant meats, or bowls of jade-colored soup, enriched with herbs believed to enhance clarity of mind. Every morsel, every sip, carried a weight beyond the palate, a reminder that the emperor's presence imbued the mundane with significance. Court life, however, was never merely about sustenance or appearance. Reports arrived daily, delivered by couriers traveling across mountains, rivers, and deserts, bearing news both mundane and critical. Some were administrative, accounts of taxes collected, grain shipments delayed, or the birth of a child in a provincial governor's family, while others detailed unrest, whispers of rebellion, or unusual omens observed by astrologers. Ministers debated, often with veiled tension, presenting facts and interpretations that could either soothe or alarm, while the emperor listened with practiced patience, occasionally interjecting with questions that cut to the core of the matter. Subtle hints, a pause before a response, or a raised eyebrow could shift the atmosphere in an instant, and those present learned to read these signals with near-perfect precision. Amid these responsibilities, whispers circulated through the palace, carrying rumors that ranged from trivial to dangerous. Some spoke of generals plotting ambitious maneuvers along the northern borders, others of concubines secretly influencing decisions, and still others of merchants in the capital hiding unusual wealth or rare objects, sending word back to the emperor. It is said that some rulers delighted in the game of deciphering truth from exaggeration, enjoying the quiet thrill of uncovering schemes before they could take root, while others regarded every rumor as a potential threat to stability. Even the smallest gesture, an unexplained glance or a misplaced cup, might spark speculation, a reminder that life at court was as much about perception as it was about reality. Occasionally, the emperor would step away from the weight of administration to witness festivals or ceremonies, events that combined tradition, spectacle, and politics in equal measure. Lantern festivals illuminated the night with thousands of glowing lights, reflecting upon the waters of the palace ponds, while fireworks painted the sky with fleeting, brilliant color. During these times, performers reenacted famous battles or tales of legendary heroes, and the emperor, though often observing from a raised platform, was subtly assessing the skill, loyalty, and creativity of those who entertained the court. Even in moments of apparent leisure, there was an undercurrent of judgment, a recognition that every act, every gesture, could carry implications for loyalty, favor, or future influence. Travel within the empire was another layer of the emperor's complex existence. Though the Forbidden City was the heart of power, journeys to other palaces, temples, or border towns offered glimpses of the land's diversity and its people. Caravans moved with meticulous precision, carrying attendants, gifts, supplies, and security, while the emperor passed through bustling villages, mountains veiled in mist, and rivers teeming with life. Each stop offered both opportunity and risk: audiences with local governors, visits to sacred sites, inspections of trade routes, and brief interactions with subjects whose lives were shaped directly or indirectly by imperial decree. Such journeys were a balance between visibility and discretion, for the emperor's presence could inspire awe, loyalty, or fear, and the smallest misstep could ripple across miles. Meals during these travels mirrored palace precision, yet carried unique regional flavors that reflected the wealth of the empire. Local chefs were summoned, and dishes often highlighted ingredients unknown or rare in the capital. Fragrant mushrooms from the mountains, fish freshly caught from winding rivers, and fruits imbued with the sun of distant valleys. Each meal became a lesson, a sensory map of the land, a reminder that even as the emperor's authority was absolute, the empire itself was vast, intricate, and alive with countless lives, each contributing to the tapestry of governance, trade, and culture. Entertainment and artistic expression traveled with the emperor as well. Musicians from distant provinces performed in courtyards, their instruments unfamiliar yet mesmerizing, producing sounds that echoed against stone walls and bamboo groves alike. Storytellers recounted legends, sometimes flattering, sometimes cautionary, illustrating morality, courage, and human folly. The emperor observed, occasionally interjecting questions or subtle challenges, testing comprehension, insight, or the creativity of performers and courtiers alike. Such moments offered both amusement and instruction, a reminder that even the highest authority could engage in learning, reflection, and enjoyment beyond the confines of formal governance. As night fell during these journeys, rituals persisted. Candles were arranged with precision, incense burned to purify the air, and guards positioned themselves with calculated care. Even in foreign palaces or temporary lodgings, the emperor's chambers reflected his presence and status, ensuring continuity, protection, and comfort. Dreams were recorded, interpreted, and discussed in the quiet hours, offering insight into omens, intentions, or the subtle movements of fortune. This continuous cycle of observation, reflection, and ritual, whether in the palace or on the road, defined the emperor's life, weaving together power, duty, curiosity, and the quiet, human pursuit of understanding one's place in the vast, complex empire that stretched in every direction. The days passed in a rhythm that balanced duty, ceremony, and the quiet intrigues that never ceased within the palace walls. Even as the sun rose high over tiled rooftops and painted eaves, the emperor's life was never truly solitary, though moments of solitude were rare and treasured. Courtiers moved like shadows, anticipating needs, whispering hints of news from distant provinces, or reminding each other of ancient protocol. The emperor, always observant, had learned to weigh not only words but the silences between them, the subtle shift of a glance, the measured movement of hands. Rumors could travel faster than horses, and a single careless word could spread like wildfire, reaching the emperor's ears by the next morning. Some whispers spoke of rebellion, others of secret romances, and some even suggested omens seen in the stars or unusual behavior among palace animals. Each fragment of information a puzzle demanding attention. Within these walls, the emperor's personal habits were as deliberate as the empire he governed. Tea ceremonies, performed multiple times a day, offered moments of contemplation, where the rising steam from porcelain cups mirrored the flow of thought and strategy. Occasionally, the emperor would indulge in painting or calligraphy, sometimes with a brush passed down through generations, its bristles soft from decades of use, tracing delicate lines that captured clouds, mountains, or mythical creatures with almost ethereal precision. Music, too, was never merely background. It was a study of harmony, rhythm, and emotion. Musicians were chosen for skill and temperament, their compositions reflecting not only tradition but the subtle moods of the day, the personality of the emperor, and the delicate politics that surrounded him. Festivals punctuated this life with grandeur and purpose, blending celebration with ritualized observation. During the Lunar New Year, the palace came alive with color, sound, and movement. Red lanterns swayed gently above courtyards, Embroidered banners fluttered in the morning breeze, and performers enacted historical tales that both entertained and reminded all present of moral lessons, bravery, and loyalty. The emperor's presence transformed these spectacles into lessons of governance and diplomacy, as emissaries, governors, and local dignitaries observed not only the performances but the reactions of the ruler, interpreting even a subtle smile or frown as a signal of favor or disapproval. Fireworks, first in the night sky and later reflected in still palace ponds, were more than celebration. They were demonstrations of both artistry and mastery, carefully timed to awe, inspire, and occasionally warn. Even in moments of leisure, the emperor's life was intertwined with learning, observation, and strategy. Chess-like games were sometimes played with generals or scholars, the pieces representing armies, provinces, or trade routes. Moves were deliberate, discussions intense, and outcomes analyzed as if real battles could hinge on a single misjudgment. Historical texts were read aloud in private chambers, accompanied by subtle commentary or debate, allowing the emperor to draw lessons from the successes and failures of past dynasties. Observers marveled at the depth of concentration and insight, for even entertainment was layered with instruction and insight, a reminder that in this life, almost nothing was ever purely simple. Meals continued to offer both sustenance and ceremony, each carefully considered to maintain both health and symbolic balance. Rare fruits arrived from distant regions, their colors vivid, their tastes unfamiliar, often reserved for the emperor alone or shared in private with favored ministers. Fish was served whole, its eyes and scales polished to reflect abundance and prosperity, while delicate meats and vegetables were sliced and presented with artistry that rivaled the palace's finest paintings. Every course was observed, noted, and remembered, both for pleasure and as part of the subtle, ongoing communication between the ruler and those who surrounded him. Travel within the palace or to nearby territories added another layer of intrigue. Secret passageways, hidden courtyards, and private chambers allowed the emperor to move unseen, observing court life without being observed, listening to conversations that might reveal truth, loyalty, or threat. It is said that some emperors developed a near-intuitive sense of people's motives, reading gestures, expressions, and speech with uncanny precision, making even casual encounters a test of character and intention. Night brought both ritual and reflection. The emperor would walk through gardens, noting the alignment of stones, the bloom of flowers, and the subtle whisper of water along carefully constructed canals. Incense burned in delicate holders, filling the air with fragrance meant to purify, soothe, and invite clarity of thought. Attendants prepared chambers with the same meticulous care, ensuring comfort, security, and adherence to centuries-old traditions. Dreams were rarely left to chance. Diviners, astrologers, and trusted advisors interpreted patterns, symbols, and visions, weaving them into guidance for decisions, actions, and strategies to come. Sleep itself was a continuation of duty, a pause in a life defined by observation, responsibility, and the quiet pursuit of knowledge, control, and understanding. Rare celebrations and visits added splashes of unpredictability. Foreign emissaries arrived with gifts of spice, silk, or intricate carvings, offering both diplomacy and subtle challenge. Markets and provincial officials sometimes traveled with messages of innovation, craft, or trade, presenting the emperor with the diversity of life across the empire. Even animals held significance. Rare birds, exotic beasts, and meticulously bred horses were both entertainment and status symbols, their care reflecting the sophistication and wealth of the realm. Observing them, the emperor learned patience, attention, and the unspoken language of care that paralleled governance itself. In all these layers, ritual, entertainment, diplomacy, meals, and quiet reflection, the life of an emperor in medieval China unfolded as a complex, almost hypnotic tapestry. Power was never simply displayed. It was exercised, observed, interpreted, and balanced against centuries of tradition, human desire, and the subtle movements of fortune and perception. And in this intricate dance of responsibility, ceremony, and quiet curiosity, the emperor lived a life both extraordinary and profoundly human, a rhythm that pulsed not only through his own existence but through the vast, sprawling empire he ruled, shaping it with every breath, glance, and decision. As the weeks unfolded in the Grand Palace, the emperor's life continued to balance between the visible and the hidden, the ceremonial and the secretive. Even as attendants moved with silent precision, and the echo of footsteps along marble halls became a familiar rhythm, there were layers of activity and intention that the untrained eye would never notice. Within the gilded walls, secret conversations took place behind screens, in courtyards shadowed by carved pavilions, or in small chambers tucked away from prying eyes. Here, trusted advisors, sometimes masked in humility, sometimes boldly offering insight, discussed matters of loyalty, strategy, and subtle power shifts. The emperor, acutely aware of both what was said and unsaid, used these moments to gauge truth, test patience, and understand the intricate web of relationships that defined court life. Education, both formal and personal, played a continuous role in his daily existence. Scholars, philosophers, and astrologers were summoned not only to provide guidance but to challenge, provoke, and expand the emperor's understanding of the world. Ancient texts, some centuries old, were read aloud and discussed at length, their meaning unpacked layer by layer. Mathematics, astronomy, and geography were explored with meticulous care, for a single miscalculation could have repercussions in taxation, trade, or military strategy. At times, the emperor himself would sketch diagrams, plot constellations, or draft intricate maps of distant provinces, tracing rivers and mountain ranges with ink-stained fingers, merging curiosity with duty in a practice that balanced intellect and power. The emperor's personal pleasures, though subtle, were deeply intertwined with his identity as a ruler. In quiet moments, he might engage with poetry, composing lines that mirrored the natural world, the empire's events, or philosophical musings on life and governance. Music offered both solace and instruction. He would listen attentively to guqin or bamboo flute, occasionally suggesting variations, demonstrating that even the ruler's ears and mind sought refinement and understanding. Occasionally, he might wander into private gardens at dusk, observing the behavior of birds, insects, and koi in the ponds, finding both meditation and metaphor in their movements, considering how the smallest element could reflect greater truths about the empire and those who served it. But life within the palace was never free from intrigue. Some whispers hinted at plots among concubines or officials seeking favor. Others suggested subtle maneuvering by generals or ministers who wished to shape policy in unseen ways. It is said that the emperor took a measured pleasure in unraveling such schemes, for understanding the intentions behind a glance, a word, or a gift was as valuable as any military conquest. Courtiers and attendants learned quickly to temper ambition with caution, recognizing that a single misstep could alter their fortunes or shift the balance of influence in the inner courts. Even the seemingly mundane, where one sat at a banquet, how one carried oneself in the presence of the emperor, or the timing of one's gestures, could carry meaning far beyond what appeared on the surface. The palace was also a stage for rare and spectacular events, moments where art, diplomacy, and strategy converged. Visiting dignitaries presented gifts, each chosen with thought for its political, cultural, or symbolic significance. Exotic animals, delicate silks, and foreign spices were examined, appreciated, and sometimes subtly tested for authenticity, for deception or flattery could mask intentions. Performances were often carefully orchestrated, not merely to entertain but to observe reactions, gauge alliances, and evaluate the skills and loyalty of those who presented them. The emperor's presence, always attentive and deliberate, ensured that even celebration carried the weight of judgment, teaching all present that power was both visible and invisible, overt and subtle. Meals continued to serve as both nourishment and ritual. Rare delicacies arrived from remote regions, fish from northern rivers, fruits nurtured in southern valleys, mushrooms harvested in mountainous forests. Chefs, trained over decades, prepared each dish with artistry, considering taste, texture, and appearance, while also paying homage to tradition, symbolism, and the delicate balance of flavors thought to influence mind, body, and fortune. The emperor's enjoyment was deliberate, nuanced, and observed, each bite a reflection of his discernment, patience, and appreciation for the meticulous orchestration that underpinned life in the palace. Evenings offered moments of reflection and subtle study. The emperor often consulted astrologers, diviners, and trusted sages, interpreting omens, stars, and patterns in daily occurrences. These interpretations influenced decisions ranging from the timing of military campaigns to the allocation of resources, and even the arrangement of palace gardens and ceremonial events. Such consultations were carried out with utmost discretion, for while some guidance came from superstition, much came from experience, knowledge of human nature, and the careful observation of patterns over years of rule. In quieter hours, the emperor's chambers were filled with objects of contemplation and curiosity. Scrolls depicting historical battles, intricate carvings of mythical creatures, and rare artifacts from distant lands created an environment where history, art, and intellect intersected. He would study these objects, sometimes sketching, sometimes reflecting, often considering their meaning in the broader tapestry of his reign. These private moments allowed the emperor to exercise thought unbound by ceremony, a rare and valuable freedom amid the relentless responsibilities of ruling an empire spanning vast territories, climates, and peoples. Thus, the life of the emperor was a continuous interplay of observation, reflection, ceremony, and subtle action, each element woven into a tapestry that demanded attention, discipline, and insight. Whether through the careful selection of meals, the scrutiny of courtiers, or the contemplation of art and stars, he navigated a world of immense complexity, where power was never static and every gesture, every decision, resonated through the empire in ways both visible and unseen. And as night descended, lanterns illuminating the silent courtyards and gardens, the emperor would retreat once more to the quiet meditation of his chambers, prepared for dreams that might guide the next day's intricate dance of duty, strategy, and reflection. A life as extraordinary as it was exacting, as solitary as it was magnificent. Autumn arrived in the empire like a gentle whisper, coloring the palace gardens in shades of amber and crimson, and bringing with it festivals that combined devotion, spectacle, and subtle displays of power. The emperor, attired in robes embroidered with motifs reflecting the season, walked slowly through courtyards strewn with fallen leaves, observing the rhythm of court life as it shifted with the turning of the year. Courtiers moved in a measured choreography, adjusting decorations, rehearsing performances, and presenting seasonal delicacies. The air was thick with the scent of chrysanthemums, roasted chestnuts, and incense, each aroma carrying symbolism, history, and careful intention, reminding all present that even pleasure in the palace was framed by meaning, ritual, and observation. Hunting expeditions, though less frequent than administrative duties, were carefully orchestrated events that combined exercise, strategy, and display. The emperor would mount his horse, a creature bred for strength, endurance, and elegance, and lead a carefully chosen group of attendants and hunters into nearby forests. These excursions were more than sport. They served as tests of skill, judgment, and patience, and as lessons in leadership for the generals who accompanied him. Birds of prey, hounds trained for tracking, and carefully marked pathways ensured both safety and spectacle. Observing the hunt, the emperor measured not only the prowess of his companions but the precision of preparation, the discipline of the animals, and the unpredictable behavior of nature itself, all reflecting principles that applied as readily to governance as to the chase. Private audiences remained a constant, intimate layer of palace life. The emperor summoned scholars, inventors, astrologers, and alchemists to present ideas, discoveries, and predictions. One day might bring a mathematician with calculations for irrigation or tax collection. The next, an astrologer interpreting celestial patterns or eclipses, suggesting favorable times for ceremonies or campaigns. Alchemists, seeking to create elixirs of longevity, presented their subtle concoctions, blending herbs, minerals, and rare ingredients, their work mingling superstition with experimentation. The emperor listened, questioned, and sometimes challenged them, for discernment was as vital as knowledge, and the ability to separate truth from exaggeration, insight from trickery, was a skill honed over years of observation and subtle reasoning. Evenings in the palace were often illuminated by festivals of sound, movement, and visual delight. Lanterns, painted with mythological scenes, floated in reflecting pools, their flickering light creating illusions of dragons swimming beneath the surface. Music filled the halls, ranging from delicate zither melodies to robust drum ensembles that echoed through courtyards, each performance a carefully constructed combination of entertainment and instruction. Storytellers and performers enacted dramas drawn from history, folklore, and morality tales, their expressions, gestures, and timing scrutinized by all who understood the importance of nuance and subtle messaging. A single reaction from the emperor, an approving nod, a thoughtful pause, or even a minor frown, could ripple through the court, signaling favor, disapproval, or caution to those who watched with keen eyes. Meals, even amid festivities, retained their dual role of nourishment and ritual. Dishes reflected both abundance and seasonal change. Steamed dumplings shaped like autumn leaves, sweet rice cakes infused with local honey, roasted chestnuts carefully peeled and arranged, and tea steeped with delicate petals that released their color and aroma slowly. Chefs, often operating under watchful eyes, balanced tradition and innovation. For every flavor, every texture, and every presentation was a message. Food was both art and diplomacy, reflecting the emperor's attention to detail, his appreciation for subtlety, and his understanding that even sustenance could communicate status, intention, and thoughtfulness. Intrigues, subtle and persistent, continued beneath the surface of celebration. Courtiers whispered in shadowed corridors, concubines maneuvered for influence, and ministers jostled for positions of subtle power. The emperor, attuned to nuance, observed without immediate reaction, allowing actions and words to reveal intentions over time. It is said that the most skilled rulers could interpret a glance, a hesitation, or a misplaced gesture, revealing ambitions, loyalties, or hidden schemes. These silent lessons were as valuable as any formal instruction, shaping decisions, alliances, and the subtle currents of influence that defined palace life. Rare visitors brought an additional layer of intrigue and fascination. Merchants from distant provinces arrived with exotic silks, spices, and curiosities that stimulated the imagination and served as conversation starters. Envoys from neighboring kingdoms presented gifts, their elegance matched by subtle diplomacy, offering opportunities to observe culture, politics, and personality. Even the smallest trinket, a carved box, a rare bird, or a unique gemstone, could carry significance, prompting reflection, counsel, or action. The emperor learned to weigh both the object and the intention, for nothing within the palace was purely aesthetic. Every interaction had meaning, and every gesture had consequence. As night deepened, the emperor often retired to quiet contemplation. Incense burned steadily, lanterns glimmered softly, and attendants ensured both comfort and ritual observance. Scrolls, objects, and instruments lay ready for reflection or study, and dreams were carefully recorded and interpreted, offering guidance for decisions, insight into human behavior, and subtle hints about the empire's trajectory. In these hours, the layers of observation, ritual, and reflection converged, forming a continuous thread that connected power, knowledge, curiosity, and the quiet humanity of one individual tasked with guiding a vast, living empire. Through festivals, hunts, private audiences, meals, and quiet contemplation, the emperor's life remained a delicate balance of spectacle, responsibility, and curiosity. Every action, from the placement of a lantern to the timing of a performance, from the preparation of a dish to the evaluation of a visitor, was woven into the broader tapestry of the empire. And in the rhythm of these days, filled with duty, reflection, and occasional delight, the emperor continued to navigate the infinite complexity of power, tradition, and human nature, ensuring that each moment, however fleeting, resonated far beyond the walls of the palace, shaping not only the life of the ruler but the very fabric of the empire itself. As the cold winds of winter approached, the emperor prepared for journeys that were both ceremonial and strategic, traveling beyond the familiar walls of the palace into regions where the pulse of the empire beat with a different rhythm. Caravans were organized with meticulous attention. Horses chosen for endurance, attendants selected for loyalty and discretion, and supplies packed to maintain comfort, ritual, and status. Every detail was scrutinized, for the emperor's presence was more than an honor. It was a statement of power, influence, and the interconnectedness of a vast realm. Along the way, villages and towns displayed banners, performers, and carefully prepared offerings, each a reflection of the region's respect, creativity, and understanding of the symbolic importance of the ruler's gaze. These travels, though outwardly grand and ceremonial, offered private opportunities for observation and reflection. Along rivers lined with frost-covered willows, through snow-dusted mountains, and across frozen plains, the emperor would listen to reports from local officials, sometimes in whispered conversations shielded from the crowd, sometimes in public displays of consultation that reinforced authority. Governors described harvests, trade, taxation, and social dynamics, and the emperor, ever observant, noted not only the content of these reports but the manner of delivery, the subtle gestures, and even the inconsistencies that might hint at deeper truths. Such journeys allowed the emperor to gauge loyalty, test the wisdom of ministers, and witness firsthand the successes and failures that reports alone could never convey. Winter festivals punctuated these travels with color, warmth, and ritual. Courtyards, blanketed with snow, were transformed into scenes of celebration, lanterns glowing against the darkness, and performers enacting legendary tales from the history of the empire. Acrobats, storytellers, and musicians presented feats that combined entertainment with demonstration of skill, discipline, and ingenuity. The emperor watched with careful attention, evaluating not only performance but character, for excellence and courage were valued, subtle errors observed, and reactions carefully noted. Even in moments of apparent amusement, the undercurrent of judgment and reflection persisted, reinforcing the continuous interplay of power, observation, and learning that defined the emperor's life. Meals during these travels, though constrained by environment, retained the artistry and symbolism of palace cuisine. Stews rich with preserved vegetables, roasted meats seasoned with exotic spices, and delicate teas served in porcelain cups offered both nourishment and contemplation. Chefs traveled with the court, often creating inventive dishes that reflected regional ingredients while honoring the emperor's refined tastes and the traditional balance of flavors believed to influence mind, body, and fortune. Each meal was a ritual, a lesson in both subtlety and abundance, providing insight into the diversity of the empire and the complex interplay between sustenance, status, and culture. Diplomatic audiences were another layer of complexity in the emperor's itinerant life. Envoys from neighboring kingdoms or distant provinces within the empire arrived bearing gifts, messages, and requests. Exotic silks, rare spices, intricately carved statuettes, and unusual animals were examined for authenticity, symbolism, and intent. The emperor, ever discerning, weighed each offering, observed the behavior of the giver, and considered the potential consequences of acceptance, rejection, or display. Even a seemingly minor gift, a feathered fan, a delicate scroll, a gemstone carved into a rare shape, could carry political weight, signaling allegiance, ambition, or subtle manipulation. The dance of diplomacy required patience, intelligence, and intuition, as the emperor navigated each interaction with a balance of magnanimity and discernment. Private study and reflection accompanied the journey, often in quiet chambers illuminated by lanterns, or in temporary pavilions overlooking frozen streams and snow-dusted gardens. Scrolls of history, philosophy, and science were consulted, ideas debated with scholars and advisors, and lessons drawn from both past empires and the natural world. Observations of the landscape, the movement of animals, and the behavior of people provided insight into governance, human nature, and strategy, reinforcing the continuous, almost meditative process by which the emperor maintained both authority and understanding. Evenings during travel carried their own rituals. Incense burned steadily, reflecting off walls or frost-covered windows, and attendants arranged rooms for comfort, security, and contemplation. Dreams were recorded and interpreted, considered alongside omens from the stars or patterns observed in daily life. These quiet moments allowed the emperor to step away from the relentless rhythm of court life and reflect upon decisions, relationships, and the subtle currents shaping the empire. Observation, patience, and reflection were as critical to governance as any decree, and in these hours, the emperor exercised a solitary yet profound authority, blending experience, intuition, and insight. Throughout these journeys, the emperor's life continued to weave together the threads of power, ritual, curiosity, and subtle delight. From observing the precision of a caravan's preparation to evaluating the honesty of an envoy, from tasting the delicacies of distant lands to listening to the stories of performers and scholars, every experience became part of a larger, intricate tapestry. In this continuous flow of duty, reflection, ceremony, and observation, the emperor navigated the infinite complexity of human behavior, governance, and tradition, shaping an empire not only through decrees and displays of authority, but through the quiet, deliberate attention to detail that defined the life of one of history's most exacting rulers. Amid the chill of winter, the emperor found solace and stimulation in the company of sages, philosophers, and secret tutors who visited the palace under the strictest discretion. These meetings, often held in secluded chambers behind lattice screens, allowed the emperor to explore knowledge that was both ancient and forward-thinking, spanning mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Scrolls lined with precise calligraphy were unrolled, each symbol and diagram a map of understanding, and discussions unfolded like rivers, meandering through logic, speculation, and contemplation. These tutors were chosen not only for expertise but for temperament, subtlety, and the courage to challenge, for a ruler who never questioned could not truly lead, and the palace was a laboratory of thought as much as it was a seat of power. During these sessions, the emperor would pose questions that seemed simple on the surface yet were designed to probe deeper reasoning. The balance of governance and morality, the implications of alliances with distant states, or the consequences of altering trade routes or taxation systems. Tutors responded with intricate analysis, stories of past dynasties, and hypothetical scenarios that blurred the line between history and philosophy. The emperor listened with patience, weighing both the content and the delivery, observing subtle gestures and hesitations, understanding that insight often lay in nuance rather than the spoken word alone. It is said that some of these sessions stretched late into the night, lanterns flickering as snow drifted softly outside, while the emperor's mind absorbed both explicit knowledge and the silent lessons of wisdom, patience, and judgment. Unusual rituals punctuated life during these months, offering both spiritual reflection and practical observation. The emperor sometimes engaged in solitary meditations at dawn, walking through gardens heavy with frost, observing the patterns of wind and water, or counting the steps between stones arranged in precise geometric formations. Each movement, each alignment of lantern or incense stick, was calculated, reflecting a philosophy that connected the cosmos, human behavior, and governance in subtle but deliberate ways. Courtiers, sworn to discretion, observed from a distance, learning that true understanding often required patience, attention, and a willingness to perceive the invisible threads linking action, consequence, and meaning. Festivals during this time brought a contrast of color, sound, and interaction. Lanterns floated across frozen ponds, casting reflections that shimmered and danced as though alive. Storytellers enacted parables of moral courage, betrayal, and loyalty, while musicians played instruments whose tones echoed like the voices of the mountains and rivers themselves. Even a brief glance from the emperor, a nod, a pause, or a moment of contemplation, could send ripples of understanding throughout the court, revealing subtle approval, caution, or admonishment. These events were more than entertainment. They were lessons in human behavior, a theater in which the emperor observed, judged, and subtly guided the currents of influence, teaching all present that every action had meaning beyond what appeared. Meals remained both ceremonial and experimental. Dishes incorporated regional variations, rare herbs, and preserved delicacies, blending tradition with innovation. One day might feature fish marinated in winter spices, tender roots roasted over fragrant wood, and confections infused with the subtle sweetness of distant fruits. Each course carried symbolism, reflecting abundance, wisdom, or harmony, and the emperor's reaction to taste, texture, and presentation was noted, discussed, and remembered. Chefs, scholars, and courtiers alike understood that even sustenance was a medium of communication, a tool to convey order, preference, and subtle approval or disfavor. Secret correspondences added yet another layer of the emperor's life. Letters from distant provinces, carefully folded and sealed, contained intelligence, appeals, or cultural reports. Some brought insights into local disputes, rare commodities, or scientific innovations. Others contained poetry, philosophical musings, or reflections intended to engage the emperor's intellect and curiosity. Reading and responding to these messages was itself an art, requiring discretion, analysis, and foresight, for the empire was vast, and each decision, however minor it appeared, could have cascading effects across miles, mountains, and rivers. Evenings often concluded with the quiet reflection of celestial observation. The emperor would examine the stars, noting alignments, eclipses, or unusual patterns, interpreting these phenomena in the context of tradition, astrology, and personal judgment. Such moments were both contemplative and instructive, reminding the emperor that the empire existed within larger cycles of nature and time, and that awareness of these cycles was as crucial as attention to the immediate affairs of state. In this blend of science, superstition, and philosophy, the ruler exercised a subtle form of power, harmonizing observation, reflection, and insight to guide decisions with care and precision. Through secret teachings, unusual rituals, festivals, and reflection, the emperor's life wove together threads of knowledge, experience, and careful observation. Each day was a continuation of duty and curiosity, blending ceremony with private exploration, public performance with hidden contemplation. Power, wisdom, and understanding were inseparable, and in the quiet of secluded chambers, the flicker of lanterns, or the reflection of lanterns on frozen ponds, the emperor's existence was both extraordinary and profoundly human. A life lived at the intersection of duty, intellect, ritual, and the subtle art of ruling an empire that spanned vast lands and generations. As the deep winter settled across the empire, the emperor's days took on a rhythm that balanced the ceremonial, the strategic, and the quietly personal. Snow blanketed courtyards and gardens, transforming familiar spaces into landscapes of pristine white, and lanterns glimmered against the frost like captured stars. These moments were not merely aesthetic. They were opportunities for observation, reflection, and subtle experimentation. The emperor would walk along frozen paths, noting the behavior of attendants, the movement of animals in the palace grounds, and the shifting patterns of snow and ice. Even in silence, lessons were absorbed. Patience, attention to detail, and the understanding that life's smallest elements could mirror the complexities of governance. Winter festivals continued to punctuate life with color, movement, and meaning. Lanterns, each painted with elaborate scenes from mythology, history, or seasonal symbolism, floated across frozen ponds, creating an illusion of dragons, phoenixes, and ancient sages gliding beneath the surface. Performances were both entertainment and education. Acrobats defied gravity while illustrating lessons of discipline, dancers enacted moral tales, and musicians filled halls with melodies whose subtle variations reflected the emperor's moods and preferences. Attendants and courtiers knew that every gesture, pause, and expression was observed, for the emperor's reactions, however minute, could influence the flow of favor, the rise of influence, or the perception of loyalty within the palace. Hunting expeditions adapted to winter's chill were both practical and symbolic. Mounted on horses chosen for their endurance and steadiness, the emperor led small groups of trusted attendants and hunters through forests blanketed in snow. Hawks and hounds were used to track prey, while careful attention was given to strategy, timing, and the behavior of both animals and companions. These excursions were more than sport. They were exercises in leadership, observation, and patience, teaching generals and attendants alike about judgment, precision, and the interconnectedness of all elements within a carefully managed system. Even a misstep by a hound, or the subtle hesitation of a rider, offered lessons in anticipation, correction, and understanding of human and animal behavior alike. Within the palace, secret sessions with sages, philosophers, and astrologers continued to shape the emperor's understanding of the world. Some visitors presented complex theories of governance, exploring taxation, resource management, or diplomatic strategy. Others delved into mathematics, astronomy, and geography, offering observations that could influence the planning of harvests, trade, or military campaigns. The emperor engaged fully, posing questions designed to uncover deeper reasoning, challenging assumptions, and analyzing not only content but the subtleties of delivery, expression, and intent. These sessions often extended late into the night, the quiet of the palace punctuated by the flicker of lantern light, snow tapping against latticed windows, and the whispered exchange of ideas that blurred the line between learning and contemplation. Evenings were also filled with unusual rituals, combining reflection, spiritual alignment, and subtle observation. The emperor would often arrange lanterns or incense in precise geometric patterns, meditate while walking among snow-dusted gardens, or study the reflection of the moon on frozen ponds. These practices were at once personal, symbolic, and instructive, serving as exercises in discipline, observation, and mindfulness. Courtiers who observed from a distance learned the value of subtlety, patience, and discretion, understanding that insight often lay in the small, silent acts rather than in overt displays of knowledge or power. Meals, even during travel or festival preparation, retained their ceremonial and reflective quality. Dishes incorporated seasonal ingredients and rare delicacies. Stews infused with preserved roots and herbs, roasted meats paired with regional spices, and desserts carefully shaped to reflect symbolic motifs. Chefs worked with meticulous care, aware that the emperor's appreciation or critique carried meaning far beyond the dining table. Each bite was a lesson in balance, texture, and intention, reflecting the interconnectedness of sustenance, ritual, and authority. Even in something as seemingly simple as a meal, the emperor's attention to detail reinforced the continuous presence of observation and judgment, shaping the environment and the people within it. Intrigues within the palace deepened as winter progressed. Courtiers and ministers maneuvered for influence, concubines sought favor, and attendants navigated the subtle politics of service. The emperor, skilled in discernment, observed these dynamics with patience, allowing actions and words to reveal intentions over time. Even the smallest gestures, a delayed bow, a slightly altered tone, or the choice of a gift, could indicate loyalty, ambition, or hidden schemes. Understanding these nuances was as vital as knowledge of policy or military strategy. for the unseen currents of palace life often dictated outcomes as profoundly as any battle or decree. Occasionally, unusual visitors arrived from distant provinces, bringing rare animals, curiosities, or innovations. The emperor observed not only the objects themselves but the behavior of the envoys, the symbolism of the offerings, and the subtle messages embedded in gesture and speech. A carved figurine, an exotic bird, or a delicate musical instrument could carry meaning, challenge perception, or test discernment. These encounters provided both intellectual stimulation and practical insight, reminding the emperor that leadership was exercised not only through commands but through careful observation, interpretation, and the navigation of complex human behavior. Night concluded with quiet contemplation, often accompanied by the study of celestial patterns, divinations, or philosophical reflection. The emperor interpreted stars, omens, and dreams, connecting observations of the natural world with the rhythms of human affairs. Such practice reinforced the ongoing balance between ceremony, duty, observation, and reflection, weaving together power, knowledge, and subtle insight into a continuous rhythm. In these hours, the emperor's existence was both solitary and profoundly engaged, a blend of responsibility, curiosity, and deliberate attention that shaped not only daily life but the broader trajectory of an empire spanning vast lands, diverse cultures, and countless generations. As winter gradually receded, leaving trails of frost along the palace roofs and garden paths, the emperor prepared for a series of events that were rare, elaborate, and carefully orchestrated to reflect both tradition and subtle displays of authority. Among these was a festival honoring the ancestors, an occasion that combined ritual, observation, and education. Courtyards were filled with lanterns, incense, and offerings, each arranged with precise intention, and participants, from ministers to attendants, moved through their roles with choreographed discipline. The emperor walked slowly among them, observing the placement of objects, the timing of gestures, and the expressions of each individual, understanding that this festival was not only a celebration but also a measure of attentiveness, loyalty, and comprehension of cultural norms. Private lessons continued to occupy the emperor's hours, often in chambers lined with scrolls, maps, and artifacts from distant lands. Philosophers debated ethics, mathematicians explored principles that could influence trade and taxation, and astrologers interpreted celestial patterns to suggest auspicious moments for policy or ceremony. The emperor engaged actively, challenging assumptions, proposing alternative interpretations, and weighing both information and intention. Some sessions extended late into the night, lantern light flickering against walls adorned with intricate calligraphy, while snow drifted silently outside. These private studies were as much about observation as learning, for understanding the subtle interplay of knowledge, character, and motive was essential to effective rule. Diplomatic audiences took on unusual forms during this period. Envoys arrived from distant kingdoms with gifts carefully chosen to reflect both cultural significance and political intent. Exotic silks, spices, instruments, and even animals were examined not only for their value or authenticity, but for the subtleties in presentation, demeanor, and gesture. The emperor listened attentively, interpreting the layers of meaning beneath each offering, each bow, each carefully worded sentence. Decisions, whether acceptance, acknowledgement, or measured rebuke, were made with deliberation, reflecting the intricate dance of diplomacy, perception, and strategy that defined the empire's relations both within its borders and beyond. Entertainment, although seemingly leisurely, served multiple purposes. Performances combined artistry with instruction. Acrobats demonstrated discipline and balance, storytellers enacted parables emphasizing morality and loyalty, and musicians conveyed emotion and history through subtle variations in rhythm and melody. Festivals occasionally included games of skill and chance, designed to test focus, judgment, and quick thinking, subtly reinforcing lessons about patience, strategy, and adaptability. The emperor participated selectively, observing the interactions of courtiers and attendants, noting patterns of behavior and assessing both character and competence. In these moments, amusement and instruction merged seamlessly, revealing the depth and breadth of palace life beyond the visible pageantry. Meals during this time were carefully curated to reflect both seasonal availability and symbolic meaning. Delicacies arrived from distant provinces, smoked fish from northern rivers, roots and herbs from mountain valleys, preserved fruits from southern orchards. Chefs, trained in both culinary artistry and the subtleties of presentation, crafted dishes that engaged sight, smell, and taste, ensuring that each course conveyed balance, refinement, and attention to detail. The emperor's appreciation, or subtle critique, was noted by all, reinforcing lessons about discernment, observation, and the interplay between pleasure and authority. Even a seemingly minor adjustment in seasoning or presentation could signal favor, caution, or instruction, a reminder that in the emperor's world, every detail carried weight. Secret correspondences added another layer of complexity to palace life. Letters from distant provinces, often containing intelligence, appeals, or rare commodities, were studied carefully. Some brought news of disputes, innovations, or natural events that could influence governance. Others contained philosophical reflections, poetry, or advice intended to engage the emperor's intellect. Reading and interpreting these letters required skill, discretion, and foresight, as even minor misjudgments could have consequences across miles of territory, affecting trade, loyalty, and the stability of governance. The emperor's decisions, deliberate and measured, reflected both knowledge and an understanding of human behavior, perception, and subtle influence. Recreation and personal exploration continued to occupy moments of solitude. The emperor often walked through gardens, observing patterns of frost, the behavior of birds, or the subtle shifts in wind and water. Meditation, drawing, and study of celestial phenomena offered quiet reflection, reinforcing lessons learned from both public duty and private contemplation. These moments, though solitary, were rich with insight, allowing the emperor to integrate experience, observation, and reflection into a continuous, evolving understanding of both the empire and his own role within it. Evenings often concluded with rituals connecting the emperor to both history and nature. Incense burned steadily, lanterns glimmered softly, and scrolls or artifacts were studied with care. Dreams were recorded and interpreted, stars observed for patterns and alignments, and philosophical reflections pondered in silence. These practices reinforced the continuous interplay of ceremony, observation, curiosity, and authority that defined the emperor's life. In the quiet of the palace, amidst snow-dusted courtyards and softly flickering lanterns, the ruler's existence blended extraordinary responsibility with profound reflection, shaping both daily life and the enduring legacy of an empire that stretched across vast lands, cultures, and generations. As winter's final frost melted and the first signs of spring emerged, the emperor's attention shifted toward preparations that were both practical and ceremonial, balancing the demands of governance with the subtle rhythms of seasonal change. Gardens were pruned, courtyards swept, and ceremonial halls cleaned and adorned with the first blossoms of the year: plum, cherry, and magnolia, each carrying symbolic significance of renewal, endurance, and wisdom. The emperor walked among these early blooms with attentive eyes, noting their placement, health, and alignment, reflecting not only aesthetic appreciation but the underlying principle that even the smallest details of nature could mirror the care and order required in governance. Spring also brought journeys that were both exploratory and strategic. The emperor traveled to regions where rivers swelled from melting snow, fields began to green, and distant mountains revealed hidden valleys previously obscured by winter's frost. These excursions were opportunities to observe the empire's far reaches firsthand, engaging with local officials, witnessing agricultural preparations, and noting the condition of infrastructure, roads, and trade routes. Alongside ceremonial duties, these travels offered moments for quiet reflection, meditation, and the enjoyment of nature's subtle changes. reinforcing the understanding that ruling required both attention to detail and awareness of broader patterns. Within the palace, secretive gatherings continued to shape the emperor's understanding of philosophy, strategy, and human nature. Tutors and sages presented ideas that ranged from metaphysics to mathematics, often challenging assumptions and encouraging debate. Some sessions involved ethical dilemmas, examining the consequences of governance choices on distant provinces or individual lives. Others explored practical innovations in administration, agriculture, or defense. The emperor engaged with curiosity and discernment, testing the reasoning of his advisors, observing both content and the subtleties of delivery, gestures, and hesitation. These private studies were as much about understanding people as understanding ideas, for insight into character was as critical to rule as knowledge of policy or law. Spring festivals added layers of spectacle, education, and diplomacy. Courtyards and halls were decorated with vibrant banners, intricate lanterns, and flowering branches. Performances included acrobatics, storytelling, music, and martial displays, each chosen not only for entertainment, but to illustrate lessons of loyalty, courage, and strategy. The emperor observed with deliberate attention, noting the precision, creativity, and responsiveness of performers and attendants alike. These events, though festive, were deeply intertwined with the practice of discernment, as subtle judgments about timing, execution, and behavior could ripple through the court, influencing favor, alliances, and the flow of influence. Meals during this season highlighted the renewal of nature, incorporating early herbs, fresh greens, and delicate proteins sourced from rivers and fields. Chefs, mindful of both taste and symbolism, prepared dishes that reflected the harmony of spring, balancing flavors, textures, and presentation. The emperor's engagement with these meals went beyond consumption. Each course offered lessons in attention, refinement, and appreciation for the interconnectedness of ingredients, preparation, and ritual. Even in moments of apparent leisure, the principles of observation, judgment, and symbolic meaning were ever present, reinforcing the continuous balance between pleasure, duty, and discernment. Intrigues among ministers and courtiers intensified as spring signaled new opportunities for influence and favor. Advisors proposed plans, subtly competed for attention, or sought to position themselves advantageously. The emperor observed without haste, allowing intentions, strategies, and errors to reveal themselves over time. Even minor gestures, a bow slightly delayed, a word carefully chosen, or a glance directed with subtle meaning, carried weight, and the ruler's ability to interpret these signals was as vital to maintaining authority as any policy or decree. Discretion, patience, and insight were cultivated continuously, for the palace was a living organism of ambition, loyalty, and human complexity. Personal pursuits continued alongside public duties. The emperor engaged in artistic study, sketching landscapes, practicing calligraphy, or listening attentively to music that reflected both local traditions and foreign influences. He explored philosophical texts, sometimes discussing abstract ideas with trusted sages or contemplating their meaning in solitude. These private moments, rich in reflection and quiet curiosity, allowed the emperor to integrate knowledge, observation, and experience, maintaining a balance between introspection and the relentless demands of rule. Evenings were marked by contemplation, ritual, and observation. Lanterns glimmered across courtyards, incense perfumed private chambers, and scrolls or artifacts were studied in preparation for decisions, ceremonies, or discussions with advisors. Dreams were recorded and interpreted, celestial patterns examined, and insights from observation, reflection, and previous experiences integrated into plans for governance, festivals, and diplomatic engagement. In these quiet hours, the emperor's existence blended extraordinary responsibility with introspection, demonstrating a life of continuous attention, curiosity, and subtle mastery over both the visible and unseen currents of power. Through the cycle of seasonal preparation, travel, festival, meal, intrigue, and contemplation. The emperor's life unfolded as a delicate balance of authority, observation, reflection, and personal engagement. Every action, whether public or private, mundane or ceremonial, contributed to the intricate tapestry of governance, culture, and human understanding. In the rhythms of spring, as buds emerged and rivers flowed anew, the emperor navigated an empire that was at once immense, intricate, and alive, shaping it not only through decrees but through a continuous practice of careful attention, wisdom, and the subtle art of ruling with insight, patience, and measured curiosity. As spring matured into the full warmth of summer, the emperor's life transformed once again, reflecting both the demands of rule and the subtle pleasures that could be found in observation, study, and celebration. Summer brought extended travels to distant provinces, where rivers sparkled under the sun, fields swayed with golden grain, and mountains revealed hidden valleys previously inaccessible. These journeys were designed not only for ceremonial display but for the careful assessment of the empire's resources, infrastructure, and the effectiveness of local governance. Alongside the elaborate caravans, the emperor moved with attentive curiosity, noting the health of crops, the organization of markets, and the demeanor of local officials, recognizing that the smallest details often revealed the greatest truths. During these travels, festivals emerged spontaneously, sometimes in villages, sometimes in temporary palaces erected for seasonal celebrations. Lanterns, though less necessary under the long days of summer, were replaced by vivid banners, painted screens, and suspended ornaments reflecting the sun's movement across the sky. Acrobats, storytellers, and musicians performed pieces specifically chosen to illustrate moral lessons, historical exploits, or philosophical ideas, blending entertainment with instruction. Observers knew that every performance was scrutinized, not merely for artistic merit, but for insight into character, discipline, and responsiveness. A frown, a pause, or a nod from the emperor could alter perception, favor, or influence within the court, revealing once again that power was exercised as much through subtle observation as through decree. Meals continued to reflect the season, highlighting both abundance and artistry. Fresh herbs, tender vegetables, river fish, and early summer fruits were arranged with care, creating dishes that stimulated not only taste but also reflection on the balance and harmony of ingredients. Chefs were challenged to innovate while respecting tradition, crafting combinations that could delight, surprise, and instruct simultaneously. The emperor's engagement with these meals was deliberate, offering subtle signals to attendants, ministers, and visiting envoys, reinforcing lessons in discernment, appreciation, and the connection between the mundane and the symbolic in daily life. Diplomatic missions gained prominence during summer, as envoys from distant lands sought the emperor's attention with gifts, proposals, and requests. Exotic silks, rare spices, and carefully crafted artifacts were examined not merely for their physical value, but for the intentions embedded in presentation, posture, and narrative. Some envoys brought news of distant conflicts, trade innovations, or cultural achievements, while others offered counsel cloaked in flattery or subtle negotiation. The emperor listened attentively, interpreting every gesture and tone, weighing immediate benefit against long-term consequence, and crafting responses that reflected both wisdom and strategy. Amid these external duties, the emperor devoted considerable time to the education of heirs and close disciples. Lessons combined the theoretical with the practical, covering ethics, strategy, literature, and philosophy, as well as observation of court life, diplomacy, and ceremonial precision. Tutors demonstrated principles of governance through narrative, example, and sometimes subtle challenge, encouraging the young to consider the consequences of action, the interpretation of behavior, and the integration of knowledge with discretion. The emperor observed closely, noting not only comprehension but character, understanding that the cultivation of future leaders was as delicate and continuous a task as any ruling of the present. Summer evenings often featured private contemplation, an extension of both ritual and reflection. Lanterns glimmered across courtyards, incense curled through the warm air, and the sounds of distant rivers, wind through trees, or the soft laughter of attendants provided a backdrop for quiet meditation. The emperor considered the lessons of the day, decisions made, observations recorded, interactions interpreted, and integrated these into a growing understanding of both human nature and the natural world. The subtle interplay between observation, judgment, and experience reinforced a continuous cycle of learning, reflection, and strategic thought. Rare entertainments occasionally punctuated these months, blending spectacle with instruction and subtle assessment. Falconry, an art combining skill, patience, and intuition, was practiced in sprawling courtyards or open fields. Martial displays were conducted not only to entertain but to demonstrate discipline, coordination, and tactical understanding. Storytelling continued to occupy a central place, with narratives drawing from history, myth, or philosophy, often presenting dilemmas, paradoxes, or challenges for listeners to consider, weaving instruction seamlessly into amusement. The emperor's reactions, though often subtle, guided interpretation, signaling approval, caution, or inquiry to those who understood the language of gesture, pause, and attention. In quieter moments, the emperor engaged in solitary observation of nature, watching birds nesting along rivers, following the course of the sun across mountain peaks, or listening to the rustle of leaves in summer winds. These moments, though private, offered insight into patterns of change, the interplay of forces within the environment, and subtle lessons applicable to governance, strategy, and human behavior. Observation, reflection, and patience formed the foundation of these practices, reinforcing the connection between ruler, subjects, and the natural world in a continuous, intertwined rhythm. Through travel, festivals, diplomacy, education, and personal reflection, the emperor's life in summer continued to intertwine spectacle, duty, and contemplation. Each action, each meal, each festival, and each observation contributed to the delicate tapestry of authority, wisdom, and insight that defined existence at the heart of the empire. The warmth of the season revealed not only the vibrancy of the land and its people, but the ongoing responsibility, curiosity, and deliberate attention required to maintain an empire that was vast, intricate, and alive, shaping both present governance and the legacy of generations yet to come. As the warmth of summer slowly waned and the first hints of autumn colored the trees with golden and crimson hues, the emperor began preparations for a season that demanded both foresight and ceremony, blending the practical demands of governance with the intricate rhythms of culture and ritual. Gardens were tended with care, harvests monitored, and storage facilities inspected, ensuring that the abundance of summer would translate into security, sustenance, and stability for the months ahead. Courtyards were adorned with seasonal decorations, chrysanthemums and gourds arranged in precise patterns, incense burners positioned to reflect symbolic alignments, and lanterns prepared for ceremonies that would welcome the harvest while invoking blessings for the coming winter. During this period, rare ceremonies were conducted that blended tradition, observation, and subtle instruction. One such event involved the careful arrangement of offerings representing the four directions, the elements, and ancestral wisdom, with courtiers and attendants performing rituals that demanded precise timing and disciplined attention. The emperor moved through the space slowly, observing gestures, alignment, and expression, aware that these displays were not merely spiritual but served as a measure of comprehension, loyalty, and refinement within the court. A misstep, however minor, could reveal inattentiveness, ambition, or subtle defiance, making the emperor's presence both a blessing and a test. Diplomatic matters intensified as the changing season required careful management of resources, alliances, and regional governance. Envoys from distant provinces arrived with messages, gifts, and proposals that varied from the practical to the highly symbolic. Exotic silks, rare minerals, ceremonial weapons, and intricately carved artifacts were examined with scrutiny, not only for authenticity but for the intentions embedded within presentation, posture, and rhetoric. The emperor listened attentively, observing minute gestures, hesitations, and patterns of speech, understanding that diplomacy was as much a matter of perception and subtlety as it was of explicit agreement. Decisions made during these sessions often had cascading effects across the empire, influencing trade, loyalty, and regional stability. Education and mentorship remained a central focus during this transitional season. The emperor engaged closely with heirs, disciples, and trusted advisors, exploring strategy, ethics, philosophy, and governance through a combination of discussion, demonstration, and subtle challenge. Lessons were integrated with observation of real-world dynamics. The behavior of attendants, the timing of festivals, or the arrangement of ceremonial spaces served as practical exercises in discernment and critical thinking. The emperor encouraged questions, reflection, and even disagreement, understanding that the cultivation of judgment, patience, and insight was as essential as knowledge itself. Meals continued to be both ceremonial and instructive, reflecting the changing season with ingredients sourced from freshly harvested crops, rivers, and forests. Stews, roasted meats, vegetables, and delicate confections were prepared with attention to balance, presentation, and symbolism, each dish offering an opportunity to observe, evaluate, and instruct. The emperor's engagement with meals reinforced lessons about appreciation, discernment, and the subtle interplay between sustenance, ritual, and authority. Even minor adjustments in seasoning, arrangement, or timing conveyed subtle messages of approval, caution, or instruction, demonstrating that the act of dining was never merely mundane. Personal moments of reflection became increasingly important as the days shortened and the air grew crisp. The emperor would walk through gardens adorned with autumn leaves, observing the patterns of wind, the behavior of animals preparing for colder months, and the shifting colors of flora. Meditation, sketching, and study of celestial phenomena provided insight, reinforcing lessons drawn from the natural world, ceremonial practice, and human behavior. These quiet moments allowed integration of observation, reflection, and strategic thought, ensuring that knowledge was applied with discretion and awareness. Rare entertainments punctuated this season, blending spectacle, instruction, and subtle evaluation. Falconry, horseback displays, and martial demonstrations tested skill, patience, and coordination, while storytelling, music, and performance illustrated moral, philosophical, and strategic lessons. The emperor's reactions were carefully observed by courtiers, performers, and attendants. For subtle expressions, nods or gestures could signal favor, caution, or inquiry. These events, although entertaining, reinforced the continuous cycle of observation, learning, and influence that permeated life within the palace. Evenings in autumn emphasized the integration of reflection, ritual, and preparation. Lanterns illuminated courtyards and chambers, incense burned steadily, and scrolls or artifacts were studied in anticipation of forthcoming decisions, ceremonies, or diplomatic engagements. Dreams were recorded and interpreted, stars observed for alignment and pattern, and insights from the day's observations woven into ongoing strategies for governance and ceremonial planning. Through the blend of public duty, private reflection, and ceremonial precision, the emperor maintained a balance between observation, curiosity, and authority, ensuring that the rhythms of empire continued seamlessly even as the world shifted toward winter. In these months of preparation, ceremony, and quiet reflection, the emperor's life revealed the depth, complexity, and continuity required to govern a vast, intricate empire. Every gesture, every observation, every meal, and every conversation contributed to an elaborate tapestry of knowledge, judgment, and subtle influence. As the leaves turned and the air sharpened, the emperor navigated the delicate intersection of power, wisdom, culture, and human behavior, ensuring that each decision, lesson, and ritual reinforced the enduring legacy of an extraordinary life at the heart of an empire that spanned generations, landscapes, and centuries of careful attention and insight.